See my psychedelic mic that I set up.
I saw that. Somebody mentioned it yesterday. It is crazy. Where'd you find that?
It's on Amazon or something. It was supposed to have buttons on the top, and it might, but I don't know how to make them work.
Well, it still looks cool. Looks very cool.
Yeah. You're supposed to be able to make it stay a solid color. I don't know how you do that either. Because I'm technically challenged, so.
Well, yeah. One day you'll be moving it and accidentally bump it, and then won't be able to change color again.
That might be true. That might be true. But anyway, all right. We are going to get started. If you guys would repost the space out to your crew, I would appreciate it. This is chapter 3 of The Splendid Blonde Beast. This one starts out saying that in the end, the delegates of the Paris Peace Conference insisted on including in the 1919 Treaty of Versailles provisions that required the German government to admit responsibility for instigating the war and to turn over crime suspects and evidence to military courts of the associated powers for trial. Lansing's view concerning crimes against humanity prevailed, however, and that phrase is not found anywhere in the peace treaty. First, crimes against humanity included atrocities that were criminal only under civil law, but also under the most elementary morality, yet were not technically war crimes, according to their definition. The new definition included domestic campaigns to exterminate a particular ethnic or religious group, as well as institutionalized slavery, even though neither of these were considered a war crime under the Hague or Geneva Conventions. Second, many, although not all, atrocities committed by the government against its own people were defined as crimes against humanity. It was the Turkish government's attempted genocide of the country's largest Armenian population that had led to the demand for a clear international ban on crimes against humanity. Turkey was the center of the Ottoman Empire, and the Armenians were a large minority group whose ancestral homes clustered around Mount Ararat in eastern Turkey. During the last decades of the 19th century, Turkish religious extremists and security forces seeking racial and religious purity in Turkey had repeatedly instigated pogroms, murdering tens of thousands of Armenians. One result of that was militant Armenians took up arms and began pressing for political independence, which is exactly what happened when they redefined Kurdistan and put another minority under Turkish rule in the south, known as the Kurds. Exactly what happens. If you oppress people, they're going to get militant in protecting themselves. Shortly before World War I, a secretive and disciplined cabal of young Turkish military officers known as Ilahad took power in Turkey and brought the country into an alliance with Germany. They were the original Young Turks. Their cruelty and violence still reverberates there today. In the first months of World War I, the Young Turks instigated a national effort to exterminate Armenian population under the guise of modernization, suppressing domestic dissent and security. The Ittihad bent the power of the Turkish state to its own purpose. Beginning in late 1914 and accelerating over the next 3 years, the Turkish government rounded up Armenian men for forced labor, worked many to death building the railroad for German business interests. And keep in mind, many of these German interests were co funded by the US, courtesy of Sullivan and Cromwell. Then they would shoot the survivors. The government then secretly ordered mass executions of Armenian intellectuals and political leaders in the spring of 1915. The state also uprooted Armenian women and children from their homes and drove them into vast resettlement camps and were barren of supplies or shelter. And again, this is very similar to the Phoenix program, as well as what they did in Cambodia. When the camps became full, the Turkish expelled the people into the desert of what is today Syria and Iraq. Hundreds of thousands of Armenians died from starvation and exposure. The state declared that all of their property of the deported Armenian families had been, quote unquote, abandoned. They confiscated it and used it for their own. Many Turks prospered by liquidating Armenian businesses, stealing their stocks, and seizing Armenian farms and real estate. The genocide was particularly cruel to Armenian to Armenian women and girls who became objects of perversion and campaigns of rape. Turkish police encouraged gangs of thugs to prey upon the deportees as a means of humiliating and destroying these women. Meanwhile, some Armenian girls were able to escape deportation by announcing a religious conversion to Islam. Turkish men secured them as Armenian concubines and house slaves. Let's see. Alini, I'm going to put you as co-host, just so they keep bumping Bridget out. Surviving Turkish, German, and US documents established that the Iliad expected to strike quickly and to keep deportations and massacres secret and to exterminate the Armenians as a race before the outside world learned of any of it. The Iliad also persecuted substantial numbers of Greeks, Jews, and other minority groups. In such cases, deporting them along with Armenians, the Turkish government made a careful effort to explain away leaks that appeared in the press as nothing more than exaggerated accounts of casualties of war. Their empire was primarily Islamic, and Armenians were largely Christians. When the genocide began, a number of Western diplomats and Christian missionaries in Turkey, including a German pastor by the name of Johannes Lippius, made determined efforts to record the massacres and deportations and to mobilize world opinion against Turkish actions. The U.S. ambassador to Turkey was none other than Henry Morgenthau, and several other U.S. consuls publicly protested the deportations and began to aid refugees, an unusually courageous gesture by diplomats. Publicity against the atrocities became particularly strong in countries where news media remained hungry for wartime atrocity stories. They took advantage of labeling this as inspired by Germany. They were willing to give full play to deeply rooted Christian prejudices against Muslims. Tragically, the Armenians could supply an almost unlimited number of accounts of these tragedies. Unlike some war propaganda, most of these stories were true. In the end, the Armenians and their supporters failed to mobilize international support to halt the mass killings and deportations. At the height of the pogroms in 1915, the governments of France, Great Britain, and Tsarist Russia issued a joint declaration denouncing the mass killings of Armenians as crimes against humanity. They warned the leaders of Turkish governments that they would be held personally responsible. But there was little behind the rhetoric. The associated powers basically abandoned their claims on Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, and, and Jamal Pasha, a member of the group that ruled Turkey, had settled into Damascus and exercised local control over much of what is today Syria, Jordan, and Israel. In late 1915, while the Turkish efforts to exterminate Armenians were at their height, Jamal, and you spell his first name Djemal, sought out the Armenian emissary and convinced him to carry an offer to the governments of the associated powers. If Tsarist Russia, France, and Britain would back him, Jamal promised he would undertake a coup of the Young Turks and end the massacres and take Turkey out of the war. He would emerge as a sultan. The price of the plan was that European powers would abandon imperial claims to what is today Iraq and Syria and provide reconstitution assistance to his government after the war. For his part, he was willing to concede control of Constantinople and the Dardanelles to Russia. Jamal Demogel appears to have acted on the mistaken assumption that saving Armenians was actually a goal. It was important Allied objective, so he thought. The Russians favored his plan and for a time assured him that the other associated powers would cooperate. But in early 1916, France rejected the offer and claimed southern Turkey, Syria, and parts of Iraq for themselves. So land, territory, and colonialism was more important than people. Great Britain quickly followed suit, claiming Iraq on behalf of local Iraqi governments created by London. In their passion for booty, the Allied governments lost sight of the conditions of the people the Armenian people. Jamal afforded the Allies their one great opportunity to subvert the Ottoman Empire from within and to save lives. They let it go. Nor did the Allies exploit his attempted betrayal of his colleagues for propaganda or intelligence purposes. As far as can be determined, the Young Turks never learned of his secret correspondence with the enemy. By the time Paris Peace Conference began, there was widespread sentiment among the victorious nations that justice required some form of trial and punishment of those who perpetrated atrocities in Turkey. The Idiad dictatorship crumbled as the war drew to a close, and a new Western-backed Turkish government signed the armistice with the associated powers in late 1918. 2 days later, most of the senior Idiad leaders fled their country for Germany, which granted them asylum. They left behind many who had collaborated in the genocide, including state and local administrators, party activists, Turkish businessmen, and farmers who had seized Armenian property, policemen, and a variety of specialists that were culpable in the mass violence. The new Turkish government arrested several hundred former party members who were suspected of direct roles in the deportations and began to prepare cases against them for murder, treason, theft, and similar offenses. The new Turkish authorities carried out a series of these trials between 1919 and 1920, placing on the public record an important collection of confessions of former Idiad members, secret state and party documents, and the tactics used for the deportation and mass murder. The outline reflected several hundred leaders that were culpable in the crimes. Much of the evidence was published in an official Turkish parliamentary gazette. The trials were strongly opposed by a rising Turkish nationalist movement, however, which regarded the prosecutions as a symbol of foreign efforts to dismember Turkey. Led by military strongman Mustafa Kemal, also known as Ataturk, a new movement welcomed idiotists in their rank and placed some of the party veterans in leading posts. Kemal's movement enjoyed great influence in the post-war Turkish military, interior ministries, and particularly the police. Kemalist sympathizers systematically delayed and obstructed the criminal prosecutions. They were destroying evidence, organizing escapes of those accused, and sparked large demonstrations and public protests against the trials. Most importantly, Britain, France, and the US were at that time vying with one another to divide up the vast oil and mineral wealth of the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Kemal skillfully played the three powers against each other and insisted on amnesty for the idiotists as part of the price for his support to this effort. Again, resources over people. Another pattern that just keeps repeating itself. The Ottoman holdings were of extraordinary value, perhaps the richest imperial treasure since the Europeans had seized the New World 4 centuries earlier. The empire had begun eroding for decades, but by the time the Turkish defeat of World War I, it still included most of what is today Turkey, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, and the oil sheikdoms of the Persian Gulf. The European governments sensed that at the time that they had their eyes on the riches in the area. The British had been dominant foreign power in the Middle East prior to World War I with their Anglo-Persian oil company, later known as BP, and the Turkish Petroleum Company effectively controlled most of the oil reserves in the region. But the French acquired an important mandate in the area during the war, and by 1919 they were seeking substantial concessions from the British. Both countries preferred to keep the US-backed Standard Oil of New Jersey out of the area. The US government, meanwhile, opposed many aspects of the European colonial rule in the Middle East, not on the grounds of them being imperial. It was on the grounds that they wanted their guy, i.e. Standard Oil, in the mix. Senior officials of all three Western powers became preoccupied with oil politics in the Middle East. It even led to an awkward new term called basically oil diplomacy. For a short time after the war, the three allies pressed the new Turkish government on two fronts. First, they supported tough punishment of the idiotist criminals, payment for damages to Armenians and Greeks for the lives and property lost during the massacres, establishment of an independent Armenian republic in northeast Turkey, and transfer to Greece of the port city of Smyrna. Second, they demanded that the Turks surrender all claims to the resources of the former Ottoman territories outside of Turkey proper, particularly Mosul oil fields in what is today Iraq. Although many Turks saw these terms as humiliatingly onerous, the first post-war Turkish government agreed to them at the Treaty of Sevres, signed in August 1920. That agreement was held at the time as the formal conclusion of World War I. But the associated powers could not agree among themselves on the terms of the division of the Mosul oil fields. And new fighting broke out between Armenian nationalists who sought to establish their republic they believed had been guaranteed to them, and the Turkish Kemalists who still regarded Armenia as part of Turkey. Kemal's embrace of the idealist contributed to an escalating cycle of revenge killings and renewed massacres in Turkey. By the end of 1920, the Kemalists were clearly in the they had control. Having established a rival government in Ankara, in the center of the country, they increased the increasingly shaky Turkish government of Istanbul, under the intense Kemalist pressure, was to abrogate the treaty that they had signed, abruptly shutting down the criminal trials. The Western Allies then stepped up their jockeying for influence with the new government. The U.S. High Commissioner to Turkey was Admiral Mark Bristol, and you spell his last name Bristol. Sorry. A man with a reputation as a bigot and a determined advocate of U.S. alliance with the new government, with Ataturk. The Armenians, Bristol wrote, are a race like the Jews. They have little or no national spirit and poor moral character. That from a military guy. It was better for the U.S., he contended, to jettison support for the Armenian Republic as soon as possible, stabilize U.S. relations with the emerging Turkish government, and to enlist Ataturk's support in gaining access to the oil fields of the former Ottoman Empire. Bristol's argument found a receptive audience in the new Harding administration in Washington, whose affinity for oil interests eventually blossomed into the famous Teapot Dome bribery scandal. Bristol had considerably more power than might be enjoyed by any conventional ambassador. As the civil war unfolded inside of Turkey, Bristol barred newspaper reporters from access to areas where renewed massacres of the Armenians was taking place, and he knew they were taking place. His correspondence to the State Department in Washington was none other than Allen Dulles, who again represents Standard Oil. After the Paris conference, Dulles had served briefly as chief of staff to Bristol, then moved on to Washington to become the chief of the State Department's Near East desk, just as the oil diplomacy rose to its heyday. Dulles supported Bristol's initiatives. Confidentially, the State Department is in a bind. Our task would be, this is Allen Dulles. Our task would be simple if the reports of the atrocities could be declared untrue and even exaggerated, but the evidence is irrefutable, Dulles wrote to Bristol. The State Department's intervention in U.S. publishers to shift the tone of news reports was still dribbling out of Turkey and Armenia. The Secretary of State wants to avoid giving the impression that while the U.S. is willing to intervene actively to protect its commercial interests, it was not willing to intervene on behalf of Christians. Dulles went on to complain about the agitation in the U.S. on behalf of the Armenians, the Greeks, and the Palestinian Jews. I've been kept busy trying to ward off congressional resolutions of sympathy for the group. Just when you thought you couldn't hate Allen Dulles anymore, you find out that it's entirely possible to hate him even more. The change in the U.S. government's response to the Armenian massacres presents an acute example of conflicts that often shape U.S. policies. From 2014 to 19, the U.S. government and public opinion sharply condemned the Turkish massacres. Ambassador Henry Morgenthau repeatedly intervened with the Turkish government to protest the killings. He raised funds for refugees and mobilized opposition to the genocide. There was strong sympathy in the United States for the Armenians throughout the war. The Western press was overwhelmingly favorable to the Armenians and hostile to the Turkish government. The New York Times published more than 100 articles concerning the massacres when the killings were at their height. All of the Times coverage was sympathetic to the Armenians. Yet a remarkable shift in the U.S. media content and government behavior took place in the new Harding administration, established itself in 1921. Those who underestimated the power of commerce in the history of the Middle East cannot have studied the post-war situation in Turkey between 1918 and 1923. There were, of course, other political factors that proved disastrous for the Armenians, but the systematic effort, chiefly by the Harding administration, to turn U.S. opinion towards Turkey was pure and simple motivated by the desire to interrupt the French and the British in their quest for the oil. It was not possible to bring about a desired change in public opinion without denigrating what the Armenians had suffered. Retired U.S. Admiral William Colby Chester joined Admiral Mark Bristol as a leading public spokesman for reconciliation with Ataturk. Chester was not a disinterested party. The Turkish government had granted him an oil concession in Iraq that was potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Writing in an influential journal, Current History, Chester contended that the Armenians had been deported not to deserts, but to the most delightful, fertile grounds in Syria at great expense and effort, a claim that was well beyond even Ataturk. A local historian reports that missionary leaders such as Cleveland Dodge and George Plimpton, who had once been instrumental in documenting the genocide, began to lend their names and to publicity, insisting that the reported Turkish excesses were greatly exaggerated. So, in other words, someone got to them. On one hand, there were demands for justice, and on the other hand, U.S. politics and commercial interest in Turkey became the de facto policy of the United States. The diplomatic shift in favor of Ataturk was handled by Ambassador Joseph Grew. Now, where's Bridget? Bridget, if you wouldn't mind, pull up Joseph Grew's biography and post that for me, because he pops up in a very interesting place in World War II. The U.S., which had been the principal international supporter of the Armenian Republic, withdrew its promises of aid and protection. Ataturk soon succeeded through force of arms in suppressing Armenia and in establishing a new Turkish government in Ankara. In July of 1922, 23, the Turks and the European allies signed a new agreement replacing the previous treaty. Western governments agreed to new Turkish borders, officially recognizing the Ataturk government, abandoning any claim on behalf of the Armenian Republic, and specifically agreed to an amnesty for all idiotists who had been convicted in the earlier trials that actually occurred. So, in other words, you see almost the exact same thing that we're going to see in World War II with John McCloy, who allowed the pardoning, basically, freeing of all of the Nazis, even the ones that had been given life in prison. It's the exact same thing. Many of the top idiotists had fled Turkey in 1918 and were assassinated by Armenian commandos that went after them. Talat, T-A-L-A-A-T, the Minister of Internal Affairs and Grand Vizier of the Idiot State, was shot in Berlin on March 15th, 1921. And it goes on to talk about several other ones whose names are so hard to pronounce, but they killed them mainly in Berlin, where they had all fled and been given amnesty. So they went after them. And they were able to get a few of the higher ranking government officials, but not near enough. Armenians lost a great deal under the terms of the new treaty, while Western commercial interests prospered. The new Turkish leader, Ataturk, agreed to relinquish all claims on the on the old Ottoman Empire outside of what was now going to be recognized as official Turkish borders, thus formally opening the door for the Anglo-American control of the Middle East oil. Again, brought about by Allen Dulles for his real customer, Standard Oil. The settlement of most reparation claims against Turkey and an agreement between Greece and Turkey to repatriate thousands of ethnic Greeks and Turks to their respective countries of origin was another result of that new treaty. There were several more years of squabbles before the U.S.-European disputes over the Mosul oil fields were finally settled. The point was, nonetheless, clear. Western governments had discarded wartime promises of action against the idiotists who had murdered about 1 million people in order to help their political maneuvering over oil concessions in the Middle East. The dominant faction of Turkish society never accepted Armenian claims as legitimate, despite the strong evidence of genocide established by Turkey's own courts. In fact, the Turkish government, even today, continues to refuse to acknowledge the responsibility of the previous government in the Armenian massacres, and has instead, in recent years, financed a large, sophisticated publicity campaign to rewrite history. Dang, that sounds familiar too. As the Western powers sparred over the Middle East oil, a series of events unfolding in Germany that would test the associated powers' commitment to punish war crimes. The Berlin government was hostile to war crime clauses that had been approved by President Wilson and the rest of the Big Four at the Paris conference. Inside Germany, only the radical left favored trials of leaders of the old regime. The German military elite, who were the main targets of the war crimes and war guilt clauses of the peace treaty, strongly opposed any cooperation with the associated powers, because the newly established Republican government in Germany was heavily dependent upon even lukewarm support from their military to avoid a coup. It too resisted cooperation. Most German politicians and press referred to war crimes provision of the Versailles Treaty as the shame paragraphs. The associated powers The Associated Powers' blockade of German ports had continued after the armistice, prolonging the extreme food shortages in some German cities and killings of hundreds of others of non-combatants. The blockade of food had been carried out coolly and deliberately after our opponents had won a certain and assured victory. Some remember that Western leaders saying, when you speak of guilt and atonement, it has no meaning. Meanwhile, the new German government created its own legal commission to refute alleged Allied war crime charges. They even enlisted Max Weber in an effort to find a means of sidestepping any responsibility for the war. This conflict over war crimes nearly led to the collapse of the armistice and a return to open warfare. In mid June 1919, the Associated Powers gave the German government 7 days to sign the treaty drawn up at Paris or face another invasion. The German cabinet refused to acquiesce, and the ruling coalition collapsed. The German defense minister warned that he had met with a group of army officers, many of whom were prepared to overthrow the government and renew the war. The Catholic Center Party managed to tack together a new government on the basis of French envoys' promise, subsequently retracted, of course, that the war guilt clauses would be cut from the treaty. The Vatican attempted to intervene on Germany's behalf, but without success. New Western governments then issued a new ultimatum stating that unless the treaty was signed as it stood, their troops would march into Germany in less than 24 hours. Germany signed only minutes before the deadline. Over the next several months, the Associated Powers drew up a list of 901 Germans whom they accused of war crimes. In most instances, the offenses were very specific. For example, the British charged one German submarine captain, Lieutenant Commander Karl Neumann, with the deliberate sinking of a hospital ship on May 26, 1917, seemingly a direct violation of the Hague Convention. Neumann's defense was that he had been ordered to do this by his superiors. They also brought an indictment against a U-boat captain responsible for the destruction of a hospital ship in June of 1918, in which 234 soldiers and nurses were killed. The German captain was said to have acted in violation of direct orders not to attack the ship and was further accused of shelling the survivors in lifeboats in order to conceal what he had done. But despite the provisions of the recently signed treaty, the German government refused to turn over the suspects or evidence to military courts. After much negotiation, the Allies agreed to let Germany try the accused criminals in their own courts. The trials were a farce. Big surprise. Roughly half of the defendants simply escaped, and the court acquitted the U-boat captain. The handful were convicted of serious crimes, including mass murder of unarmed prisoners, received prison sentence of less than 10 months. In one case, the German court convicted 2 junior officers of offense under Germany's own military code and handed down 4-year sentences, but both prisoners were allowed to escape from jail within 6 months. They were heralded as heroes in the German press. The net result of the trials was that out of a total of 901 cases of crimes brought before the court, 888 were acquitted or dismissed. Only 13 ended up with a conviction. And although the sentences were so inadequate, those who had been convicted were not even made to serve their sentence. They were allowed to escape. Meanwhile, Lansing and Wilson's position prevailed with respects to the trial of the former German monarch, Kaiser Wilhelm. The Associated Press had agreed at Paris to a compromise provision in the Versailles Treaty calling for the arraignment of the Kaiser for a supreme offense against international morality. That is, for what instigated the war. This was in truth perhaps the weakest of the plausible charges against Wilhelm. The claim that he alone should bear responsibility for beginning the war was obviously suspect even in 1919. Be that as it may, the charges against the Kaiser outlined in the treaty were offensive against moral as distinct from legal sensibilities. Wilhelm fled to Holland and gained asylum with the tacit cooperation of the British Foreign Office. And other associated powers buried their demands for a trial within months of these events. Taken as a whole, the world experience with atrocities showed that even though these crimes were highly publicized during the war, exploited for their propaganda value, and often condemned depending upon the government's relationship with the atrocity, largely for political effect, government's attitude changed immediately after the war was done. The genocide of Armenians involved thousands of perpetrators and tens of thousands of beneficiaries that stole Armenian property. Thus, even Turkey's own post war government found it difficult to try individual ringleaders without putting the country itself on trial. Each detail of legal interpretation, even in cases of seemingly extreme and obvious atrocities, became for many Turks a matter upon which national honor or even survival seemed to depend. The pressures against justice came not only from the defendant, but also from a coalition of both victorious and defeated powers. Secretary of State Lansing, again, Dulles' uncle, actions at Paris and the US, British, and French squabbles over the oil fields indicated that only months after the war had drawn to a close, powerful factions among the victors were willing to sacrifice the most elementary standards of justice for economic gain. The French suggestion to establish an international criminal court associated with the League of Nations was not even scarcely given a hearing. They chatted about it. There was another important obstacle after World War I to establish international sanctions against atrocities: money. All of the powers agreed in principle that the perpetrators of war crimes should pay damages or reparations to those they had wronged. But in a war that had resulted in millions dead and crippling injuries, such damages would have been in the tens of billions of dollars, particularly if the war itself was judged to be a criminal act. Soon it became clear to the victors and vanquished alike, that the definition of what would be classed as a war crime had sweeping implications for European trade and commerce in the decades ahead. So, there you have it. That's a broad overview of quote unquote justice during World War I that we will see again in World War II. So, go ahead, Bridget.
You know, sometimes when we go through these things, like with the Dulles brothers and their uncle and their sister, not Dulles, John Foster Dulles and so on and so forth. If you wrote a book, like a completely made up story, and you tried to sell this as a story, they wouldn't buy it. One would believe that this level of corruption would continue unchecked. Because people knew that. People within our government knew this was going on, you know?
Well, but it was our government that was propagating it. It was the government that facilitated this happening. And so to me, the control of so what's interesting about all of this to me is that initially the media reported the truth about the massacres, but then they take the truth that they've reported and they begin tapering it to so they can say they reported it. It's a matter of record. But then they start twisting it in order to facilitate their owners and the oligarchs. And in the aftermath of all of the rush to justify or legitimize all of that, there's almost a watering down of the facts in order to facilitate the moving on. And the only people that gained from this were the oligarchs. They obviously got richer as a result of the oil, and at the expense of a lot of dead bodies. Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, you might have talked about this, but I might have not heard it correctly or something in your reading. But I lived in Turkey like 5 years, so I know a little bit. So Ataturk fought the British and French and kept Turkey from being taken over by them, and it simultaneously was able to take out the Ottoman and the Sultan, the king of Turkey. And so I just want to give that context because he's like a superhero, and for the Turkish people, he kind of on numerous cultural levels saved them in making a structure whereby they could, function without a king. And yes, the Armenian genocide happened, and what is stated is that they thought that the Armenians had too much money and were too powerful with their money and would align with the French and British or with the Sultan and make it impossible for there to be success. So I just want to, this is data that I got there. I'm not saying it's actual, pure, whatever, but this is, and one of the reasons that Erdogan doesn't say it was genocide is because of the superpower of, Ataturk. He was he did so much for the country. They can't slash and burn him and then be politically standing up there because people won't take it. Anyway, that's it.
So Ataturk is worshipped as a god in Turkey. There's no doubt about that. Everywhere you go, even on Incirlik Air Base, everywhere you go in Turkey, there's Ataturk images everywhere. I disagree in the fact that he was keeping the French and British out. He fought with the Germans, okay, along with the rest of the Ottoman Empire. They were defeated. He became the strong man that was able to coalesce a government that was strong enough to conquer internal powers. And there was a lot of factions during this time inside of Turkey. And so it did take a strong man to be able to do that. And that was Ataturk. The justification of, and the Armenians were Christians, and they were not, I understand the reasoning that it was given, that they viewed them as a threat. They didn't view them as a threat necessarily because of their wealth. They viewed them as a threat because of their religious beliefs and that their refusal to convert to Islam. Because again, you're talking about the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire operated under the concept that you converted or you're going to be killed. And that was ongoing throughout World War I, which led to, and you're right in the fact that it wasn't but they didn't just take Armenians that had wealth. They wanted them all gone, which is why they rounded them up and put them in the desert. So they had already assassinated most of the men. They had taken all of their possessions. They then went the extra step to round up old people, women, and children, drive them out into a desert, and let them die. There can be no excuse for that at all. None. Because most of the fighting, except for the ones that had kind of went off in these little paramilitary kind of that ended up in Germany to kill a few of the Turkish officials that had fled there. So you're right in the fact that all generations since then have given Ataturk this godlike persona of being able to stand up and create a Turkey that is modern day Turkey. But the brushing under the rug of what they did during that transition period, they committed genocide. And someone's wealth is no excuse for killing them. Otherwise, everybody in the oligarch here in the United States would be at risk. That's not acceptable. So anyway, Ron, go ahead.
Oh, where to start? I'm sorry?
Go ahead, Ron.
Okay. Where to start today? Wow. You mentioned obviously Sullivan and Cromwell. While you were doing this, I actually posted a lengthy post about Sullivan and Cromwell and all the nefarious activities that they've been involved with, really going back to their founding in 1879 when they were doing all the stuff with the railroads and all the way up through things of current day. But you guys can check that in the bill. One of the things about Germany in World War I is they were the only ones. They actually didn't want war. They were the last country to mobilize, and in fact, it was the British who were who crafted that war. And you talked about how everybody was like dying of starvation and hunger in Germany. Well, the person who was responsible for the food relief of all the food that was going over there was none other than our 31st president, Herbert Hoover. So
yep.
That dirtbag piece of shit. So sorry for my language there, but the Germans. The Germans, you got to realize, not one shot had been fired on German soil in World War I, and they capitulated. That doesn't make any sense to me. So I could go on, I could ramble on this, and I don't want to, but I don't have any. If I have any sympathy at all, it's going to be for the Germans, and I don't. The show trials that they did for the guys that they said that they claimed were war criminals, whatever. Germany was the one who essentially was attacked. So I have a lot of sympathy for those guys, and the fact that they got light sentences or got off. Bravo. I have no love for the Turks. And in fact, I actually found a really interesting book that it's only available in Turkish, and I'm actually having it translated to English. Sorry, I can't get you a hard copy, but I will send you a PDF of the. It's all about. It's a Turkish Gladio book, but it's not available in English. It's only Turkish, and I'm having it translated right now.
Cool.
Yeah. So anyway, I'm not going to ramble, but this is kind of my wheelhouse today.
So just to piggyback on what you said, obviously this book is not about World War I per se, because everything that you said is basically true. It's really about the treatment of international war crimes and crimes against humanity, because what they are clearly articulating throughout this chapter, and as you'll see in the chapters that we go on, is there is a concerted effort by what is now NATO, and going back all the way to World War One, is that these, obviously you can make the argument that World War One was fought under false pretenses, as you just articulated, to destroy the Ottoman Empire and to take all of the riches of the Middle East, which is exactly what happened at the end of the war. In order to do that, you have to get rid of the Ottoman Empire. And in order to do that, you have to kind of isolate, squeeze in Turkey into this geographical little box. And to Carrie's point, the guy that was able to cobble together the remaining aspects of that and to establish some type of Turkish beachhead was Ataturk. And that is the reason why he is still to this day in Turkey. It is the last bastion of the former Ottoman Empire. And if you guys understand the Ottoman Empire, and it probably needs to be said, the moving of the caliphate to Turkey was huge. So Turkey has always been of paramount importance, and Ataturk was like the last man standing after World War One, and that is the reason why, because it was the head of the caliphate of the Ottoman Empire. It was critically important to not just the image of Islam, but to the Turkish people, because they had an invested pride in having moved the caliphate to that geographic region, which we now know as Turkey. So this is way bigger than what is capable of putting in this book, and is completely off topic for the purpose of the book, which is how resources has driven, and it goes right hand in hand with the unfolding after World War II of Operation Gladio, because as we have proven unequivocally, Gladio in and of itself was a paramilitary force to secure resources for NATO-aligned countries. And
Colonel, can I interrupt you real quick? So
you already did.
Would you say that Gladio is essentially the intelligence mechanisms to foster world government?
Not the intelligence. It is, because none of this has to do with intelligence. They suck at intelligence. That's why all of this shit. It is the paramilitary arm of the world government mechanism.
Copy that. Okay, so we're kind of on the same page there.
Yeah.
But the point I was going to make is World War One. The reason that Turkey had to be brought in with World War One, and specifically Germany had to be brought in with World War One, is because if you incorporate the Zionist component to this, they wanted Palestine, and Ottoman Turkey had it. And the only way to get the Ottoman Turks into the war was to get Germany into the war, which is why Germany had the treaty with the Austria-Hungary. So that's why the Archduke Ferdinand, and that plot was done in Petrograd by the British. So and then so you bring in because of the treaties, you bring in the Ottoman Turks to fight on them. And when the United States comes into the war, where did all the British troops go? They went straight down into Palestine and into the Arabian Peninsula.
Yep.
So I mean, it's because and again, it's world government military. So anyway.
Well, and dominance of all of the resources. And they had already discovered that area was rich in oil, and they wanted it all. Illini, and then we'll go to Carrie.
On that point, don't forget that those maps got drawn, for the purpose of doing strategy of tension. I mean,
Yes.
the borders of Iraq got drawn so that, you have the Sunnis and the Shia and the Kurds
Yes.
all fighting each other.
Yep.
And so that, I forget if it was the British or the French who controlled it, but the colonial powers could basically play them off each other, just like they were doing in India for hundreds of years there.
The British controlled. Hold on, Ron. Hold on a second. The British controlled Iraq and the French controlled Syria after World War One. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah, that was the Sykes-Picot Agreement.
Yeah. It's strategy of tension. You're absolutely right. And thank you for bringing that up, Illini. Carrie, go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to push back a little bit. They don't see him as a god. It's like, because God is God.
I said godlike, Carrie. I said godlike.
They see him, well, I just want to push back a little bit. It's like George Washington.
I disagree with that.
You guys think is, a great American hero. That's where they sit with it.
Yeah, I disagree with that. We do not have George Washington's face on every building, every government building, on the side of the road. I could not tell you honestly how many times, literally every building on Incirlik that was the Turkish military buildings had a statue of Ataturk in front of it. We don't do that with George Washington.
Well, he was military, and the reason he became a hero in the first place is because
who's military?
He fought this war called the Gallipoli War, and I had posted it before in the Purple Pill. So I mean that.
Carrie, Washington was a wartime hero. He wasn't, but he is not treated in America the way Ataturk is treated in Turkey. There's not even a comparison.
Well,
you cannot find George Washington's statue on any military base in the United States.
You would argue with me about the person that I picked to designate as the war hero, but I'm just telling you that that's the basis. And also, I traveled throughout Turkey.
So did I.
Ataturk signs everywhere.
They are everywhere.
Where you are. It depends. I lived in Anatolia. No Ataturk signs. It's a political point.
No, they're everywhere. They're all over Ankara. They are in Diyarbakir, that's just north of Iraq. They were in what's the other name of that town that we were in? They're everywhere. So anyway,
I don't agree, but I just want to point out
you can't disagree with what I saw, Carrie.
I'm disagreeing with your experience. I didn't have that experience. I was in Anatolia, actually, where the Armenians were based and where they lived and thrived. And there weren't Ataturk signs. No one in Haiti would have an Ataturk sign. It's a political position to support the nation. And there are people within the landmass of Turkey, like the Kurds, that don't fucking like Turkey. And they don't have an Ataturk sign. That's what I'm saying. But here, George Washington or Lincoln, one of the president, whoever, a military giant, it's the same kind of energy. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, well, and I disagree. Okay, anybody else? All right, let's go over here on Rumble. Let's see, the website is Internationalist 350, but you can find the article in Searching Sullivan and Cromwell. Okay, so There is a good article from 2018 on the web, International 360 by Hugo Turner. First part of the title is Sullivan and Cromwell. Okay. That's great. I'm going to go check that out. Also, let's see what else. Currently, all right. So just looking, Colonel, love the presentation. Thank you. Go Lafayette. AP Jonas says there is a Washington statue at West Point. You are right. There is one at West Point. And I have seen that. Thank you for reminding me of that. Let's see, who else? We are looking at Armenian genocide as a template for crimes against humanity for comparison to the Holocaust. So not necessarily. What this book tries to do is show you that at the end of the day, there is a pattern for war that in the aftermath, the United States has never had a primary objective of accountability ever. If you were to stand back at the 30,000 foot look and realize, as Ron pointed out correctly, the suspect origins of war and then the aftermath. Just, if you're a fly on the wall and you're looking at, hey, every time that there's some weird thing that happens and we end up in a war, the beneficial parties gain the all of the resources for private use, but it is the everyday American that goes over there and dies. They don't financially benefit from that, but all of the quote unquote war spoils are gobbled up by oligarchs, and they compete among themselves and lose sight in the immediate aftermath of the war of accountability of anything. It was not in the United States' best interest to hold anybody accountable, as Ron points out, for their own mischief in getting into World War II, because the whole purpose of World War I, the whole purpose was to divvy up the spoils that they were going to acquire at the end of that war. And you look at World War II, and the point will be made as we go through this book, that that's in fact what happened at the end of World War II. That it's all about, during the war, the atrocities that you can blame on the other side until the war is over. And then you don't want to hold any of the people that you were talking about for the last 4 years of being monsters accountable. It's like you just flip a switch. And, now that enemy, in the case of World War II, is going to be our buddies, because now the new boogeyman is the Soviet Union, who was just our partner in the actual war. So again, zooming out to the 30,000 foot look, you see a pattern evolving. It was true at the end of the Vietnam War. It was true because not only was that about resources in that area, it was about the heroin trade. And that turned into, hundreds of billions of dollars in covert funding as a source of revenue for these bastards to wreak havoc all over the world. And with that money, they start doing not overt wars per se, although there were a few of those. They're now doing covert ones where they go in and regime change without actually the full force of the military. And that kind of was, you see an evolutionary process of going from overt warfare, trench warfare, into these covert means. And that coincides with that cycle that I drew on the chart that one day of these people pre-World War one, actually at the end of the 1800s, where they had their own private military and intelligence agencies. And then they figure out a way post World War II to put the bill for the standing military and the standing intelligence, quote unquote, because they're not intelligence, functions of the CIA on our backs. So we're not only the ones dying in these conflicts, we're actually paying for them to kill us. And so you have post World War II, the first time ever standing army, first time ever standing intelligence, quote unquote, agency. And then you skip ahead a few decades later, and there's a hollowing out of the military itself for military contractors, and a hollowing out of the CIA for contract intelligence capability. And when you start tracing who owns the private military companies and the private intelligence companies, it's the same oligarchs who started all of the shit to begin with. So not only are we paying for that contract stuff, they're answering to those people with not a dotted line anymore, a direct line. So you have the Lockheeds who own actual intel contracted to the CIA. So they have outsourced all of that, the storage capability for all of these massive supercomputers, like in the form of Amazon. And so all of these oligarchs are enriching themselves while American normal people are going over and dying. It's beyond the pale. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to do. I wanted to read something here real quick. This was just part of that post that I submitted. Sullivan and Cromwell, founded in 1879, has served as the elite legal arm of American empire, engineering monopolies for robber barons like J.P. Morgan, shielding railroad trusts and from regulation, helping U.S. corporations dominate Latin America and the Pacific, and later facilitating Nazi-era business deals and Cold War intelligence front operations. The firm used legal innovations to consolidate wealth, undermine antitrust efforts, and protect corporate interests at home and abroad, often aligning with covert geopolitical strategies. Far from a neutral legal advisor, Sullivan and Cromwell helped structure the deep entanglement of Wall Street intelligence and global industry. So the reason I wanted to read that is because that essentially is a summary of why Sullivan and Cromwell, and specifically John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, were over there at the
Paris Peace,
the Treaty of Versailles.
Yeah.
So I mean anyway.
They were not there to represent the United States. They were there to represent the oligarchs.
Amen. Yes.
Yeah. Carrie?
Yeah, I just wanted to remind of that it's all part of the Great Game, which is the British little phrase for fucking Russia. And the other thing I wanted to say was that our landmass is huge compared to Turkey. So kind of comparing like what we got going on here to them is not necessarily fair. And one more thing, I don't think that it's not my data that Muslims would kill other religions or Christians. And the reason I have this data is because of Spain. Because when the Christians came to Spain, the Jews had to flee because of the, I guess, what is that called when all the Christians were killed? The Holy Wars? I don't remember. But so they would tax the hell out of you if you didn't convert to be a Muslim. You had to pay special tax, but it's my data that they didn't kill them. If you have different data, I'd love to see that.
I have tons of different data, Carrie. The Ottoman Empire became an empire because they killed a whole lot of people. They didn't start off in basically in control of all of that territory. And I have visited churches in southern Italy. There's one particular church, and I still have the flyer out in my box out in the garage, that I have never seen anything like this in my life, and I will never forget it either. The Ottomans, when they came ashore in southern Italy, was they basically, and you have to understand that their motto as they were creating the Ottoman Empire, it was not any different than Genghis Khan or anything else. I'm not talking about Islam as a religion. I'm talking about this as a effort hundreds of years ago of conquering territory. It's what they did. Every empire was created by killing people. You don't create empires by shaking hands and saying, "Hey, I'm going to be in charge now." This is not singling out a religion. It's just historic fact. There was a lot of people killed in order to create the Ottoman Empire. And yes, they did have an adage that you either converted to Islam or you would be killed. Now, when they got into Spain and southern Italy, as they were coming into the European continent, they realized quickly that the modern city states that were very different than going across desert areas where there's not a lot of infrastructure and complex towns to be ran. There were trading posts, and most of the territory that the Ottoman Empire embraced at the time was not well developed. Some were, most of it was not, territory-wise. But Europe was very different than that. And they quickly realized when they moved the caliphate to Turkey and it came under other administration that they were not going to be able to do that same campaign type. So they mitigated, and a lot of people, the radical elements, and this has been written about by bin Laden and many others, they viewed the moving of the caliphate to Turkey and the mitigation that happened in the aftermath of that when they got into Southern Europe as a weakening of the Islamic religion, because they started not using that same war tactic. They began making deals with people that administered the cities, that they could do that and continue to do that without converting, because there was not enough people who knew how to manage large cities and had been trained in that type of thing. So that was viewed as a critical mistake within the militant element of the Islamic religion. They viewed it as a watering down, that once that began to happen and you started making deals with the quote unquote devil, that was the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire. That's literally written in history. So I was in a church in southern Italy. Now, again, this happened after they initially came ashore in southern Italy. So the Ottomans come ashore in southern Italy, and people were led to believe that if they took refuge in the Catholic Church, that they would be safe. There's a Catholic Church that in the aftermath, so the whole town is gathered in, as many as would fit, in the basement of this church. The basement of this church is very interesting in the way that, and it's not been changed for hundreds of years. Every family had a column that they donated to the creation of this church. And again, this was hundreds of years ago. And they built this Catholic church. It's a cathedral. It's beautiful. It has a mosaic tile of the tree of life in the floor of the main sanctuary. You come in the front doors, you walk up, you're at the trunk of the tree, you walk up, and the branches of this tree of life was done in tiny mosaic across the entire floor. And there are family names of people that were present at the creation of this church whose little plaquettes hang off of the tree limbs. It's just an amazing piece of art. When you get up to the altar, there's two spires that go off the back of the church. They're very tall. They're kind of like an octagon shaped. Inside of these spires that go up are glass cases. Now, again, this is over 100 years old when I was there. I don't even know what the date is. It's in the brochure. But the town, in the aftermath of the massacre, so the Ottomans come in, they kill everybody in this church in the basement. After that happened, the people that had fled that area eventually come back, and they take the remains of the people, and they were literally chopped up. They weren't just killed, they were chopped up. They took the remains of those bodies, and they put them in these glass cases. They're not scientifically sealed, but the body parts nor the blood has ever changed colors. The body parts have never decomposed. They are there. And my daughter, who was 10 years old, it was a school field trip. I almost fell over because they're shuttered. They have these big, like, plantation shutters over them so you can't see them. And they only open them up occasionally because they're afraid that the light will affect what's in these containers, which are body parts. And the clothes are still on the people, on the limbs, on the legs. And my daughter still to this day is traumatized by seeing that. We were not expecting it. I had no idea. I didn't do any research before the field trip. You can bet I did after that. But that's the brutality that occurred when the Ottomans initially came into Europe. They quickly realized that they weren't going to be able to kill everybody. And that was mitigated as they went up through, and they got as far as France before they were eventually then pushed back out of Europe. But it was horrific what happened. But if you read anything about, like, Genghis Khan and his tirades through the countrysides and country after country, that's the way they did warfare back then. That's how they gained territory. And the Ottoman Empire didn't become an actual empire because they walked into a town and shook hands with people. Ron, go ahead.
Yeah, amen to that. And I'm just curious, and I'm not trying to stir the pot, but is she suggesting that the Armenian genocide didn't occur? Is that what I understood?
Carrie?
I'm right here, Ron.
He's asking you.
I'm not alive.
No, I don't remember. I couldn't tell who the name was, and I didn't want to say it incorrectly.
Answer him, Carrie.
I am absolutely not, and that you would think that is really sad.
No, I didn't think that. I was just seeking clarification. I wasn't trying to be insulting, not at all. I just because you'd said that you'd said a couple things that it led me to believe that maybe that's what you were insinuating, because I know that there are Turkish officials who deny that occurred.
Yes.
So,
Yeah, I'm Native American. I'm not going to walk around the planet saying people are genocided.
Okay. I wasn't. Yeah, I just was seeking clarification. That's all. No, please, no disrespect.
Okay. Now I'm going to go find that brochure because I want to know the name of that church.
By the way, Colonel, check your text messages.
Okay.
Exactly. I want to know the name of that church if you can.
I will post it. Absolutely. Okay, I got it. Okay. Anybody else? Nope. All right. So we're 3 chapters in. And just to give you guys a heads up, and the chapters in this book work out to be about an hour long. So we got a few to go. Some are not as long as others, but we'll see how long it takes us. But it definitely is an interesting book, and it obviously inspires a lot of conversation. So I'm definitely glad that we're doing the book. But there's some real bombshells in here. All right, guys. Thanks for being here. We will be back tomorrow at 4. We have the Alpha Warrior show tomorrow night at 9:30. And we have the War Hamster Power Hour at noon on Thursday. And then we'll be back at 4 o'clock then, too. So thank you guys for being here. I really appreciate it. And I will talk to you tomorrow.
Thanks, Colonel. Good night.
Night. All right, guys. Thanks for being here. Let me go down and check the comments. Thank you, Cheryl, for being here. And go Lafayette, Craig. You guys are so active over here in the chat. I love it. To take people on a field trip. I know. I could not believe it. I was like, I wanted to put my hand over my daughter's eyes. I was flabbergasted. I will never forget it. It was so gross. But just so that you know, that was a line I've got to call him right back. Just so that you know, you get the same feeling when you walk through the killing fields in Cambodia, and through that one school that they converted to a prison that they took us to. Again, I've had this happen, and I can't explain the feeling. You're not like physically nauseated sick, but it's almost like there's something that comes over you that is incredibly strong about the horror of humanity. And it just kind of like seeps into your soul when you see things like that. And walking through the killing fields, we went to the one monument that had like, I don't know, 1,000 skulls. It's a huge, big thing in Cambodia. That marks kind of the ending of what they went through. And Cambodia the Khmer Rouge was trained by the CIA. They orchestrated that entire thing, the beginning of it. And they put these dictator, mentally ill people in charge, and they just annihilate entire populations, and they don't care. They walk away with whatever they want, and it doesn't bother them. And so you have to understand that's the mentality of the people in the CIA, that they're able to do that. And they didn't do it just once. They did it over and over and over again. So yeah, it's horrific. But anyway, yeah, the CIA can't be gone fast enough. Take care, guys.